হ্যাঁ শুরু করে দে।
Good evening, everyone. So we are going to start the module 6 of our West Bengal ERY present the clinical oncology course of 2021. And today is the day 2 of the gastrointestinal cancer. So today's topic of discussion is the management of the colon cancer, management of the hepatobiliary tumors, and pancreatic and other GI tract cancer. First, we are going to start the management of the pancreatic and other GIT cancer. So to present it, I would like to invite Dr. Kakuli Choudhury. She is Associate Professor and Head of the Department in the Murshidabad Medical College and Hospital. Dr. Kakuli Choudhury, Madam, please start.
Thank you, Costa, for introduction. I'm sharing my screen. Slides are visible to everyone. Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, West Bengal Chapter ARY, for giving me such opportunity for interacting with students and welcoming my beloved student. I'm starting my topic. It is pancreatic and other gastrointestinal cancer, that is anal cancer, and few words about the neuroendocrine tumor of gastrointestinal tract. Although in this second day, I think for your exam purpose, most important is the colorectal cancer. That will be dealt by other speaker later. But pancreas is also important, not only for exam, but also for your day-to-day practice later. You will get those type of cases. First, I'm talking about the pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer, unfortunately, is a major cause of cancer death. And for last few decades, it is seen that not only in our country, but also in the developed country like Europe and USA, there is a rise. In developing country like India, it was not so much previously, but from according to Globocan 2018, worldwide it becomes 14th in its rank, and Indian data, you see the curve is rising. In both the Indian Cancer Registry and also another cancer registry from Tata Memorial Hospital. There is some risk factor which are modifiable, and some are in epidemiology which is associated with pancreatic cancer. It is seen that race-wise, the highest incidence in the African and American male patient compared to the Asian one. Geography-wise, it is also high in Hawaiian, main of Korean, Czech, Latvian, and New Zealand tribes. Gender-wise, it is commoner in male compared to female, and median age of diagnosis for white is 69, and for black, it is 65 years. Average, we get patient above 60 years. There is no clear-cut etiology of pancreatic cancer, but obviously we have some risk factor like diabetes of more than 5-year duration causes increased risk, chronic pancreatitis, hereditary pancreatitis, and some other, although rare, but some genetic disorder are also associated with increased risk of pancreatic cancer. Sometimes these are important for exam purpose, but for practical purpose in our clinic practice, usually these symptoms are not, these syndromes are not common, like Pew-Jagger syndrome, multiple endocrine neoplasia or Menn syndrome, hereditary non-polyposis colonic cancer, HNPCC syndrome, FAP or familial adenomatous polyposis, and so on, VHL also. But obviously these syndrome are in different context important for students. You have to remember what are the disease associated with these syndromes and what are the genetic mutation associated with them. Now, other modifiable risk factor which we find, that is tobacco use, obesity, diet with low fiber and high fat content, and obviously alcohol abuse. And I have already mentioned this. So these are in short the epidemiology and etiology for the pancreatic cancer. Unfortunately, the sign symptom of pancreatic cancer is not very clear cut. These are very vague, like chronic gastritis, upper abdominal pain, and that's why most of the disease, nearing 60% of the disease, presented with metastatic, 25% with locally advanced, and very rarely, that is 10 to 15% hardly, are resectable. Among them, R0 resection is possible even in less number of patients. And you see the overall survival also decreases from metastatic disease to the resectable disease. So what are the therapeutic possibility of treatment and the factors on which the therapeutic possibilities depend? Important factors related to patient is obviously age, comorbidities. As you see, the diabetic patient are more prone, alcoholic, chronic alcoholic, and obesity. All of them are causes decreased performance status of the patient. So that is also very important, whether patient is fit for therapy, whether surgery or chemotherapy or something else, I will tell later. Now the distance disease, whether it is metastatic or whether there is lymph node positive or not. And the local disease, whether it is contact with vessels or any portal hypertension is associated, all these factors are important. So pre-therapeutic assessment is very important for this patient. If radiologically we found a mass and if there is no doubt in this, then and no need of neoadjuvant therapy, that is borderline resectable, we can go for directly surgery without biopsy. And if the medical treatment come first, that is like in locally advanced or metastatic or borderline, then only biopsy is needed. Other factors, I already told that performance status, patient symptom, weight loss, nutritional assessment is also very important because surgery is associated with so many side effects or toxicities, late effects. Now then imaging. Imaging is mainly thoracoabdominopelvic CT scan for diagnosis and its extension, and the most important is resectability. Liver MRI is an option for liver metastasis diagnosis, and pancreatic MRI also optional if tumor looks atypical on CT scan. Now CA 19.9 is a marker, but it is not for diagnosis. It mostly bear prognostic information, and we do this thing for baseline and then we used it in follow-up, whether disease is in control or it is progressive. Before going to the treatment, just this, you have to remember that as a student, that is AJCC 8th edition of TNM staging for tumor or pancreas. Mostly, roughly, T1 is less than 2, 2 to 4 centimeter is T2, more than 4 centimeter is T3, and then with the local invasion of celiac axis, superior mesenteric artery, and or common hepatic artery is T4. Up to 3 nodes is N1, 4 or more nodes is N2. And then this is the stage grouping. This chart is important for surgery. Not only staging is here important, here mostly what is important, that is whether patient tumor is resectable or borderline resectable or unresectable. This is mostly done by decision is done by surgeon, but we should have, as an oncologist, you should have an idea like whether the tumor involves celiac axis, superior mesenteric artery, and common hepatic artery. These three vessels are the main thing, and from venous aspect, superior mesenteric vein and portal vein. According to involvement of this thing, these three things are divided: resectable, borderline resectable, and unresectable. When all these are involved more than 180 degree, it becomes unresectable. When there is no arterial contact, it is mostly resectable, and in between them, this is borderline resectable. But how we can assess this 180 degree involvement more than less than, we have to depend on the radiology or US endoscopy, but nothing is foolproof. Every investigation have some limitation. So it is also very common when radiologically it appears it may be resectable, but unfortunately during surgery, it finds it's more advanced or not resectable. Now the first treatment of the pancreas, pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer is only curable when it is resectable. When R0 surgery is possible, then only it is curable with good prognosis. Before going to surgery, there are we have to go through some anatomy. Few just listen, just slide. You have to see the position of the pancreas, from anatomical knowledge. You know this, and these are the curable surgery for pancreatic cancer. If it is in the head or the body of the pancreas, then the standard of care is Whipple's procedure or duodenectomy. And another option is that is pylorus preservating pancreatoduodenectomy. These two are for the head of the pancreas, and it needs at least 3 or 4 anastomosis, like gastrojejunostomy, jejunojejunostomy, and colodocojejunostomy, and pancreaticojejunostomy. So due to so much of and another is if it is in the tail of the pancreas, then it is planopancreatectomy. For both of these surgery, there are a number of toxicities or late effects. These are like exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, which leads to maldigestion and malabsorption. There is a very frequent complication of pancreatic fistula, diabetes, and also wound healing complications and infections. Splenic rupture and thromboembolic complication is another dreaded complication. That's why before going to surgery, such a radical surgery, you have to assess your patient beforehand. That's why workup is very important. Another part of surgery is biliary stenting. That is usually palliative when there is hyperbilirubinemia, renal insufficiency, cholangitis, and a new adjuvant treatment is planned. Then we go for biliary stenting for temporary, for making the patient temporarily with normal bilirubin or normal liver function. Now, this is surgery. Now, the question of adjuvant treatment, whether adjuvant treatment is needed or any good for the can do any good for this patient. Adjuvant treatment, it's a 20-year story, you can say. It started with 5-FU only, 5-fluorouracil. It's compared in SPAC1 with observation, shows better result. Then comes gemcitabine. It shows also better result than observation. And then in SPAC3, both are combined head-on, gemcitabine with 5-FU, and they show both are similar. So we can use the adjuvant therapy, single agent gemcitabine or 5-FU. Now they are combined in SPAC4. GEM with capecitabine and compared with GEM, and it shows a better result in combination. Another publication with two positive results in metastatic setting was there. One is from FOLFIRINOX and other is from gemcitabine with nab-paclitaxel. Now these two are also tested in adjuvant setting, and it is shown that if patient is fit, then M modified FOLFIRINOX is with best result. And GEM and nab-pacli, it's not so good in adjuvant. So this is FOLFIRINOX for PRODIGE 24 study. Its result it's better than single agent gemcitabine in both way, median overall survival and median and it is well tolerated also, not it's toxic from single agent, but still the toxicity can be managed, especially when we use the GCSF, which we are now commonly used. Now, modified FOLFIRINOX 12 cycle become the standard adjuvant treatment for fit patient. Otherwise, we use the single agent, either gemcitabine or 5-fluorouracil. Another study, I told you, GEM and nab-pacli compared with GEM. This result is not so good. It's a negative trial. So GEM and nab-pacli is not a approved combination for adjuvant therapy. So this is the algorithm for the resectable pancreatic tumor. If R0 resection, then go for surgery, then go for adjuvant treatment. Maximum 3 months after surgery. Duration of treatment is 6 months with modified FOLFIRINOX if fit patient, otherwise either GEM or maybe with GEM and KEP. If borderline resectable, then clinical trial, or you can go for any neoadjuvant treatment. If tumor response, then surgery, otherwise tumor progression, then switch chemotherapy or maybe some palliative radiotherapy. Now, advanced stage management or locally advanced. For locally advanced, most of them which appeared locally advanced initially, ultimately, unfortunately, come as metastatic disease. So this locally advanced and metastatic disease both are managed almost in a same way. We should start a systemic chemotherapy. Gemcitabine remains the current standard, but obviously FOLFIRINOX is an option. In different publication, it showed the better result compared to the single agent gemcitabine. And here in NCCN guideline or in USA, there is also use of concomitant chemoradiation. I will tell you after that. But one thing for locally advanced pancreatic cancer, neoadjuvant chemotherapy or this neoadjuvant chemoradiotherapy, it is not standard of care. Still, it is in trial form. Radiotherapy is not much preferred in UK in NICE guideline due to toxicity. They in UK trials mostly they shows it detrimental, but with the increase of our technique like IMRT, IGRT, all those things, now radiotherapy is again coming back in pancreatic cancer. It may be radical RT in borderline or may be used as neoadjuvant. It must be IMRT with 4D CT facility, GTV, and the GTV is the tumor and the lymph node which is more than 1 centimeter. PTV, if we used 4D CT, then 1 centimeter around ITV, and otherwise 15 millimeter anterior posterior border and 20 millimeter in superior and inferior around the GTV. Dose is usually 50.4 to 54 gray in 28 to 30 fraction, that is conventional fractionation. This is radical for neoadjuvant or for definitive. But there are other role in radiotherapy also, like palliative radiotherapy to control pain, bleeding, impending gastrointestinal obstruction, and some locally advanced disease patient which are not fit for this full dose radiation or chemotherapy, even in metastatic, just to relieve symptom. So this is the treatment for locally advanced pancreatic cancer. Now advanced stage, metastatic. Metastatic tumor is very poor prognosis with very low overall survival, but with the addition of all these systemic chemotherapeutic agent like gemcitabine, then again doublet gemcitabine with 5-FU, then FOLFIRINOX, and now the gemcitabine with nab-paclitaxel. It comes around 1 year overall survival. First line of treatment, again modified FOLFIRINOX is compared with gemcitabine which shows a better overall survival. So this become the standard of care with FOLFIRINOX, but obviously with fitness because it's toxic than the single agent gemcitabine. Maintenance is possible with FOLFIRINOX or not. As it is a toxic regime, de-escalation from FOLFIRINOX to 5-FU leucovorin after 3 to 6 months of induction is possible without impairing the PFS and OS. That is also found from PRODIGE 35 study. So if patient responds well, then we can think about that maintenance depending on the tolerability of the patient. Another combination is GEM and nab-paclitaxel. That is good in this setting, that is in metastatic disease, but we know it's not approved in the adjuvant setting. So in metastatic disease, these two are standard of care. Now, if I go to the comparison of FOLFIRINOX versus GEM nab-paclitaxel, they are almost similar in efficacy, but their safety profile are different because that neuropathy thing is more with nab-paclitaxel, whereas it's less with FOLFIRINOX, and diarrhea is more with FOLFIRINOX, and alopecia again more with nab-paclitaxel. And both the hematological toxicity are almost comparable. There are some rare variety of metastatic. These are standard of care for metastatic cancer, but there are few rare variety. These are now on trial, you can say. Just BRCNS or BRCA mutation is available. Sometimes it found that BRCA mutation is present. So PARP inhibitor have a role. These are the study which shows the activity of PARP inhibitor, olaparib versus placebo. It shows a better result when there is mutation, this germline BRCA mutation is there. And immunotherapy also these are the ongoing trial, combination trial with nivolumab, pembrolizumab. You know, the immunotherapy is the talk of the day. So in every malignancy they are tried. Here also there are a number of patients, and as the result is survival is still not good, that's why other trials are also there trying to find some other remedy for this type of patient. So molecular profiling is also a future advances. Now future direction, there are so many things in this pancreatic cancer like immunity or inflammation, metabolism, their stromal cells. So these can be potential target for the future direction of studies or research. So here I'm concluding the pancreatic part, pancreatic cancer part. This is just the summary till now what I told. Now I'm going to the another part. Uh, Dr. Kaji, are you there? Anyone have some question on
Still
this
not-
pancreatic cancer?
Till now, there is nothing in this question.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Till now there is no question.
Okay. Oh, that will be written only, no? Nothing
Yeah,
direct.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Then now I'm going to the second part. That is anal cancer. Anal cancer is important for a postgraduate student of radiation oncology because anal cancer, the main treatment or standard of care is now concomitant chemoradiation. So obviously it's our subject more than pancreatic cancer. So now first the anatomy of anal canal. These are just revision. Everyone knows that it's extend from anorectal ring dentate line to anal verge, roughly 3 to 4 centimeter, and the lower end of the anal canal is called anal verge. Region wise, we can divide it, the anal tumor into three division: anal margin tumor, small, well differentiated and common in, these are common in male. Then anal canal tumor, which are more commoner than marginal tumor, and they are moderately or poorly differentiated. Male is to female ratio is roughly 1 is to 2.5, that is more in female, and these are worse in prognosis. And then dual component tumor, majority of tumor are in this group, that means involving the whole. It's difficult to say from where it starts. Now, lymphatic drainage. Superior inguinal lymph nodes are the primary drainage basin for the part of the anal canal distal to the dentate line. Lymphatic drainage around the dentate line occurs to lymphatic plexus of the rectal mucosa and along the path of the inferior and middle hemorrhoidal vessel to the obturator and hypogastric lymph node. That means any tumor around this region, that means there is chance of involvement of pelvic lymph nodes also. And for this connection, uh, anus is connected to presacral, external iliac and deep inguinal lymph node. Now incidence is 1 to 2% of all large bowel. It's not so common. 4% of all anorectal carcinoma. Commonly found squamous cell carcinoma, that is 75 to 80%, adenocarcinoma only 50%. There is a slight male predominance, I told you, but particularly anal canal is common in female. Most commonly, a common age group is 50 to 60 years. Now risk factor previously it was there was a theory that chronic irritation results from benign condition like hemorrhoids, fissure, all these are causing the anal cancer, but there is no evidence, no scientific evidence in support of this theory. Nowadays we know persistent high-risk genotype human papillomavirus infection, that is type 16 and 18, are associated with 90% cases like cervical cancer, homosexuality and anoreceptive intercourse, STD, cervical dysplasia or cancer in female, also vaginal and vulval cancer are associated with anal cancer. HIV seropositivity also increases risk of the anal cancer, although it is not a age-defining cancer. Low CD4 count, cigarette smoking, multiple sex partner, immunosuppression following solid organ implant, all are associated with anal cancer. Pathologically, I told mostly the squamous cell carcinoma. They can be again divided according to pathological picture, cloacogenic, basaloid, and transitional variant. But all are actually squamous cell carcinoma, collectively called epidermoid tumor, may be keratinizing or non-keratinizing. Other rare varieties are adenocarcinoma, small cell carcinoma, melanoma, lymphoma, carcinoid, GIST, and undifferentiated variety. From anal margin, some other malignancy may be there, like skin, like basal cell carcinoma, Bowen's disease, Paget's disease, like that. And another thing is just like cervical carcinoma, AIN, anal intraepithelial neoplasia, just like CIN. It is also graded from 1 to 3. It is a precancerous condition, usually flat or raised. Ulceration, if there is ulceration, that means it is not AIN, it's most likely invasive one. Adenocarcinoma can arise from the anal crypt, but and they should be treated like the rectal cancer, although they can be treated with concomitant chemoradiation, but mostly their treatment is just like the rectal cancer. Anal melanoma is very rare, 1% of anal malignancy, but it's with a worse prognosis. Now, pathway of tumor spread. Tumor spread is mostly direct extension to the surrounding tissue. At diagnosis, about half of all cancers have been found to the anal sphincter and surrounding soft tissue. Upward rectum and bladder, laterally ischiorectal fossa, sphincter muscles, vagina, urethra for women, and prostate in men. Downwards, it invades perianal skin. Tenovelous fascia is usually an effective barrier to prostatic invasion for men, but direct extension to rectovaginal septum is a very common thing for female. Then lymphatic spread. Lymphatic is abundant in anus. So 25% of patients present with positive node and 50% of it can be confirmed by FNAC. Negative FNAC even not exclude malignancy, although excision biopsy is not so much recommended due to lymphedema and other type of toxicities. Low anal tumor, anal verge tumor, and anal margin tumor, they go to the perirectal node, then inguinal node, then external iliac node, common iliac node, and then paraaortic chain. Mid and upper anal canal, internal iliac node, hypogastric and obturator node, and then paraaortic node and retroperitoneal. Distant mate is not so common. It's less than 10%, and commonly we found liver mates and then rarely lungs, bones, and brain. Clinical presentation, commonest one is rectal bleeding, discharge, and discomfort. 50% of patients present with that. Approximately 30% they present with pain and some mass sensation in anal verge. Asymptomatic patient may be there, approximately 20%. Diagnosis can be delayed because this bleeding is often associated with hemorrhoids. So delayed reporting up to 6 months in 1/3 of patient, unfortunately. And another rare presentation is malignant inguinal lymph node or distant metastasis. So this is the workup of anal cancer. It's just like other malignancy. It's common. History taking, proper physical examination, then proctoscopy, then biopsy from primary tumor. Biopsy from node means ideally FNAC, not the excision biopsy. Then chest X-ray and other CT scan of abdominopelvic part, and also MRI. MRI is good for assessing the primary tumor. PET CT or PET imaging is also a good tool to assess the primary tumor and also the presence of the regional lymph nodes as well as distal lymph node. And that's why it guides the management or therapy. As there is high risk of HIV positivity, every patient should undergo HIV status testing. For female, a gynecological examination to exclude presence of other HPV associated gynecological malignancy, and every patient should counseling for the loss of fertility for both gender. Now the staging. Staging, this is I wrote in a nutshell, but you have to remember this staging. Again, that is up to 2 centimeter T1, then more than 2, up to 5 T2, T3 more than 5, T4 means local invasion, and also the nodal positivity. Now treatment overview. Until the late 1970s, the conventional treatment for anal canal was also appeared like rectal. But then gradually, radiotherapy took the place of surgery. It replaces surgery in 1980s. And after that, in 1990s, concurrent chemoradiation improves the local disease control and become the most effective treatment option for anal canal. So surgery is only restricted in AIN high grade, that is local excision, and APR for symptomatic uncontrolled multifocal disease. Small local excision is only positive when possible when it is small, well differentiated squamous cell cancer, not invaded any surrounding structure like sphincter muscle, and located distal to the dentate line, less than 20 centimeter in size. APR, if radiation is contraindicated, then this surgery or APR is the option. Contraindication of radiation, like previous radiation to pelvis. Suppose a patient received radiation for cervical cancer previously, now presented with anal cancer, then we have to go for APR. Functioning transplanted kidney and unmanageable toxicity of CRT. Here I can mention you another thing. If a very young patient presented with anal canal cancer and want to preserve her fertility, then also APR is an option, not the concomitant chemoradiation, because that will cause infertility, permanent infertility. Now, defunctioning loop colostomy or ileostomy, they needed even with concomitant chemoradiation when there is bulky tumor, fecal incontinence, evident fistulation, access, invasion to adjacent organs like vagina or urethra. And also some other, there are some study which shows that surgery followed by radiation also shows better local control, but these are not standard of care. So radiotherapy or concomitant chemoradiation. Dose is 45 gray in 20 or 25 fraction with 2 cycles of 5-FU and mitomycin C. That is followed by a 6 weeks break and a clinical assessment. If less than 50% response, then patient should undergo APR. If more than 50% response, then boost with brachytherapy, that is 10 gray per day with iridium 192, overall 25 gray, or EBRT 15 gray in 6 fractions. 5-FU dose of concomitant chemoradiation is 1 gram per meter square from day 1 to day 4, and mitomycin C 12 milligram per meter square on day 1. Second cycle is only with 5-FU, no mitomycin. And with newer trial, now this 5-FU day 1 to day 4 is replaced by capecitabine, giving every day on the radiation day in a dose of 625 milligram per meter square. There are several studies which shows that radiation versus concomitant radiation, the concomitant radiation is good in disease-free survival, local failure rate, and overall survival also. So these are a series of study. And radiotherapy technique, I already told you, you may need temporary defunctioning colostomy if there is large obstructing tumor or incontinence. Then immobilization and positioning, patient usually in supine position with arm across the chest, or maybe prone in belly bone in an alpha cradle or other immobilization device with arms extended. But with the increase of IMRT, using of IMRT technique, we are now using mostly supine position. In prone position, it is shown that prone position is usually used for primary field, and for boost, supine position is used. Now, for contrast, how to delineate the tumor. For oral contrast to delineate the small bowel, then barium enema to delineate the tumor, IV contrast to delineate the tumor and lymph node, anal marker to delineate the anus. Bolus to the natal cleft is usually required, especially when there is involvement of anal wart or skin. Where to involve inguinal lymph node and bladder should be moderately and comfortably filled. This is
Madam,
radiation.
sorry to interrupt. Could you please wrap
Yeah.
up within say 5 minutes?
Oh. Hello?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Madam, could you please wrap up within 5 minutes?
Oh, now still neuroendocrine is there. Okay,
can
I'll
add,
say just a few slides more. Okay, okay.
okay.
Okay, I'm trying. So this is the radiation dose for T1 and T2 tumor, elective 40 gray. You can see that 40, these are all IMRT technique. GTV is the gross tumor and CTV is 2.5 centimeter expansion and PTV is 1 centimeter. And the all the lymph nodes, pelvic and pelvic lymph nodes will come in the CTV. Brachytherapy is also an option, I told you, and implant can be done. Now, role of induction therapy, chemotherapy is not established. It is a trial basis thing, and side effect of pelvic radiation is just like the cervical cancer, like the GI toxicities and urinary bladder and all this thing. I'm not going into details because neuroendocrine is waiting. So this is the diagnostic and treatment algorithm for newly diagnosed anal canal. Now, salvage therapy for local recurrence. If patient treated with concomitant chemoradiation, then surgery, that is APR and a permanent colostomy, may need exenteration if it is a huge tumor. And in some cases, we can go for re-radiation with a tight field. For metastatic disease, only palliative chemotherapy is the option with cisplatin and 5-FU. Another options are mitomycin C, 5-FU, paclitaxel and carboplatin, and also palliative radiotherapy for fungating lymph node or any other rectal bleeding or symptom management. If HIV positive patient, there is high chance of toxicity. Patient should be on HERT, and also the dose of chemotherapy and radiotherapy both should be decreased. Now, this adenocarcinoma, I told, it should be treated like the rectal carcinoma, and melanoma should be like melanoma. That should be treated in some other class, hopefully. So these are the NCCN guideline. Uh, I already summarized from that, but you have to read that NCCN guideline. Now the last part, neuroendocrine tumor. This is a huge chapter, but not so important for examination. Neuroendocrine tumor, what is neuroendocrine tumor? It's the neuro means nerve, endocrine means network of glands, organizing organs in body that produce hormones. So neuroendocrine cells found in endocrine glands, adrenal, pancreas, thyroid, pituitary, ovaries, testes, everywhere. So neuroendocrine tumor or tumor of neuroendocrine system, most commonly location is the lung and the digestive. Carcinoid, we called it carcinoid when it's come from tubular gastrointestinal tract. Pancreatic neuroendocrine when it arises in pancreas, like that. Neuroendocrines are first diagnosed in 1800s, mid 1800s, but gradually we come with the knowledge what are this type of tumor, what are the features. These are in fact rare tumors, but now rising in incidence, mostly due to the increase in diagnosis. We are having more and more diagnostic tools, so we are finding more this type of tumor. This one part of this NET is very slow growing and they are well differentiated. Other are very fast growing and poorly differentiated. So pathological classification and nomenclature of NETs are like that. Depends on the mitotic count, Ki67 index, well differentiated and poorly differentiated. Again, we can call it non-functioning and functioning. Non-functioning means who do not produces hormone. Those usually don't cause any symptom, only some pressure problem. Like if the symptoms are like pain, nausea, change in bowel habit. If it is in lung, then chest infection. It depends on where it situated. Insulinomas cause low blood glucose, gluconomas high blood sugar, BIPomas diarrhea, and gastrinomas are cause ulcer. So these are when we call it carcinoid syndrome, that is due to serotonin. When serotonin is secreted from them, there is a characteristic collection of symptoms which are known as carcinoid symptom. These are investigation. There are particular investigation from blood and along with other imaging, that 5-HIAA, chromogranin A, gut hormones. These are important for diagnosis of the symptom. I'm skipping some of these. This PET CT scan, 68 gallium scan. This is important for symptom. Neuroendocrine tumor needs multidisciplinary management. Its management depends on primary site, its classification, size of tumor, metastasize or not, whether there is carcinoid syndrome or any hormone production. Target of treatment is to remove it by surgery, alleviate symptom, control the tumor growth, and maintain patient quality of life. So the localized gastrointestinal tumor, they mostly resected in pancreas, in stomach, ampulla of Vater. Most are the surgery is the main thing. May include in follow-up, we should include this biochemical marker and also the functional imaging. In advanced cases, mostly we use the hormone hypersecretion cases, somatostatin analog. And if it is resectable mets, then we consider surgery like liver mets. And if it is asymptomatic, we can go for observation only. So these are the drugs which commonly used. No one is very much good in result, but mostly commonly is somatostatin analog. Then other trials are on everolimus, sunitinib, and few chemotherapeutic agents are also there, and some radio invasive technique like hepatic arterial embolization. These are the newer agent which usually targeted the mechanism of formation of biosynthesis of serotonin. These are also in trial basis. And there is no established second line or first line. We use the platinum based combination, just like small cell lung cancer. There is no established second line. There are so many small retrospective study with different chemotherapeutic agent. And these are some future direction of trials which used in this neuroendocrine tumor. Okay, I think I completed for today. Any question from anyone?
Thank you, madam, for the excellent presentation. So, at still now there is no question in the chat box. So
Okay.
I would like to invite our next speaker. So if you have any question, you can write it down in the chat box only. So, madam, thank you very much for the excellent presentation.
Okay, thank you. May I leave now or I have to stay?
Okay, madam, as there is no question, is there? If you have works, ma'am, you can leave. No problem.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you.
So our next presenter is Dr. Upasana Mukherjee. She is going to present on the management of the hepatobiliary tumors. Upasana, please share your screen and start the presentation. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Upasana, please you unmute yourself first.
Yeah, thank you, thanks a lot. At the very outset, I would like to thank the organizers for and my seniors for giving me this opportunity to share to present today, and I hope I'm able to. Just a minute. How should I go? Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah. So quickly moving on to the topic of my presentation, it's an overview of hepatobiliary tumors. I hope I'm audible now.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So coming on to the epidemiology, the hepatobiliary cancer is the fifth most common cause of cancer in men, ninth in women, and second most frequent cause of cancer death. Most commonly, we encounter cases of hepatocellular carcinoma, which is twice more common in men than in women, and followed by gallbladder cancer, which is 3 times more common in women than in men. So coming on to HCC, there is a global variation in incidence that mirrors the variation of hepatitis B in infection. It's more commonly seen in Southeast Asia, Middle or Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, where it is 15 to 100 times more common than in North America. There is increasing incidence in Europe and US as well, and which is most likely due to the increasing hepatitis C infection and secondary to cirrhosis due to NASH, that is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Coming on to cholangiocarcinoma, it is most commonly seen in Southeastern Asia, which is most likely because of higher incidence of liver fluke parasitic infection. So finally, gallbladder cancer, as we know, there is substantial geographic variation as well. In Europe and US, it is low. In Western Europe and US, it is incidence is low, while incidence is higher, and we come across in our day-to-day clinical practice, it is incidence is higher in India, Chile, Central and Eastern Europe. So coming on to the risk factors, HCC, we know chronic viral hepatitis B infection followed by hepatitis C infection is a well-known risk factor for the development of hepatocellular carcinomas. The risk factor could also be cirrhosis due to non-viral etiology, that is alcohol, NASH, autoimmune disease, hemochromatosis, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, and toxicities due to aflatoxin B. For gallbladder cancer, there is female preponderance and chronic cholelithiasis. Other factors include obesity, diabetes, typhoid carrier state, smoking, chemical exposure. And cholangiocarcinoma, discussed earlier, the liver fluke infection. Other than that, you have hepatolithiasis, choledochal cyst, thorium oxide exposure that also lead to development of cholangiocarcinomas. Other than that, primary sclerosing cholangitis is a very important risk factor for the development of this cancer. And other than that, inflammatory bowel disease, fatty liver disease, diabetes, and smoking, alcohol, and cholelithiasis also contribute to this malignancy. Coming on to the diagnosis of hepatocellular carcinomas, we need firstly to take a history and a meticulous physical examination. The patients usually come up with complaint of right upper abdominal pain or discomfort, and as well as abdominal swelling in view of ascites. On physical examination, we may have the findings of hepatomegaly, and if the patient is having portal hypertension, there could be hepatosplenomegaly as well. So the patients are mostly CLD, like cirrhotic patients who come with complaints and features of ascites, variceal bleed, jaundice, and encephalopathy. So coming on to the lab test, we need to do a CBC, LFT, which is very important in characterization of the kind of the stage and our management, which we'll see in the later slides. Other than that, the coagulation studies. So for hepatocellular carcinoma, there is a role of AFP, especially in the prognostic value. And for cholangiocarcinoma, we analyze the serum tumor marker CA19.9. So as discussed earlier, we really need to rule out hepatitis, which is one of the most important risk factor that includes the profiling of markers like HBsAg and HB surface antibody, HB core antibodies, and anti-HCV. Now, as we have as we have come across in our residency, the hepatocellular carcinoma is one of those cancers which do not need a biopsy because of its characteristic radiological feature. So in a multiphasic MRI or CT, if we find a tumor of more than 1 size centimeter showing arterial hepatic enhancement and a delayed washout, then we don't have to undertake a biopsy proof for management of hepatocellular carcinoma patients. So in a cirrhotic background with these radiological findings, that is hepatic arterial phase enhancement followed by delayed washout, in a tumor more than 1 centimeter, biopsy proof is not mandatory. Coming on to surveillance, in all cirrhotic patients, surveillance is done in form of a USG with or without a serum AFP value every 6 monthly, and it is included in patients who suffer from hepatitis, that is the chronic HPV carriers, the HCV infected patients with bridging fibrosis, and also in Asian patients where the HBV DNA is more than 10,000 copies per ml should undergo surveillance because their annual risk is more than 0.2 6% per year. And also in advanced fibrotic cases, even after achieving a sustained virological response with treatment, they still remain at risk and hence should remain in surveillance. Now, coming on to the most important part of hepatocellular carcinoma management, that is the Barcelona Clinic liver cancer and the Child-Pugh criteria. So this is the CP criteria, which we need to understand. There are total 5 factors, 2 clinical and 3 lab parameters, that is ascites, encephalopathy, and features of encephalopathy, which is included. And for the lab parameters, we need to see the patient's bilirubin levels, the total albumin level, and the coagulation study, that is the PTINR. So these patients are then classified into 3 classes, that is A, CPA, B, and C. Class CP score A are the most are those patients whom we can manage and whom we can treat them to achieve a cure. And class B also is also given treatment for the cancer management. But for the patients who already have a very compromised liver function, that is the class C, where the score is 10 or more, these patients usually we undertake best supportive care as a treatment decision, which we'll again come across in the later slides. So this is the BCLC criteria, a busy slide. So if we go from left to right, we can see in very early stage, if the tumor nodule is less than 2 centimeter and the patient has his liver function preserved with a very good performance status, these are the potential candidates for liver transplantation. And we need to see whether the portal pressure is normal and the bilirubin levels are normal. And if it is, so we can undertake decision of liver resection. Otherwise, if it is not, or there are some features or associated disease, then we can go for radio ablation as well. Now, this decision is same for the early stage, that is BCLC A stage as well, where the nodule may be more than 1, but less than equal to 3, and the size of them should be less than equal to 3 centimeter. Again, the most importantly, preserved liver function and a good performance status. So such candidates also undertake ablation as a form of treatment, and if they have the facilities or the opportunity, then they can also go for transplantation, which is the treatment of choice. Coming on to the intermediate stage, that is the patient has a multinodular disease, but still they have the liver function preserved with a good performance status. Here we do a very unique treatment, which is unique for this particular cancer, that is chemoembolization. The more popularly, as we hear the term TACE and transarterial chemoembolization and transarterial radioembolization. Here, the most unique part of hepatocellular cancer physiology is that these tumor cells derive their nutrition from the hepatic artery, unlike the normal liver cells, which derive their nutrition from the portal vein. So this particular feature is kind of exploited, or this feature is kind of utilized for treating patients who come or fall in the category of BCLC B category. So mostly chemoembolization is the drug used is doxorubicin, and in case of radioembolization, we use yttrium 90 microspheres. Coming on to a bit advanced stage, which is unfortunately the more common presentation that we encounter or we see in our day-to-day practice. The patients already have a tumor emboli, and though their liver function may be preserved, but their performance status drops down to PS1, 2. So such patients are eligible for systemic therapy. Here the survival, which is usually more than 5 years from for early and the very early stage, drops down to almost a year. And unfortunately, for terminal stage where patient has an end stage liver disease, we have best supportive care for them to offer. So this is a summary of the ESMO guidelines. So quickly again, early stage, we know resection, or we can also have SBRT, which is a very upcoming and a promising form of a treatment in hepatocellular carcinomas. And for other than that, we also have radioablation in form of TACE and TARE for BCLC early stage. For BCLC-B, as discussed, liver resection or TACE and TARE, and systemic therapy when all these first-line treatments fail. So for resection, what we need to see is that first we do a portal vein embolization for the segment that is involved with the cancer, and this helps in assessing the hypertrophy of the FLR, the future liver remnant. Now, if the future liver remnant undergoes hypertrophy to the desired level, and then we go for the liver resection. So this helps in analyzing the future outcome of the cancer, of the surgery or the procedure, whether resection is successful or not. So coming on to the later stages, that is BCLC-C, now till May 2020, this was the treatment of choice. But this IMbrave 150 study, which was published in 14 May 2020, showed that the combination of atezolizumab and Bev showed a better PFS and overall survival benefit with the quality of life preserved. So this was compared with the standard of treatment in BCLC stage C, that is sorafenib, and there was an OS benefit achieved that was at 12 months, it was 67.2 versus 54.6. So hence, going to the previous slide for this BCLC stage C, now we would prefer atezo plus Bev, and then as category 1, this has also been included in the NCCN guidelines. So coming on to biliary tract cancer, grossly anatomy-wise, these may be classified as intrahepatic and extrahepatic. Extrahepatic cancer are further classified as perihilar cholangiocarcinomas, which is most commonly we know the term as Klatskin tumor. Other than that, after that we have distal cholangiocarcinoma, and biliary tract cancer also includes gallbladder cancers. Coming on to cholangiocarcinoma. So this is a very old classification which we have come across earlier in our surgery MBBS days. This bismuth chloride classification of perihilar cholangiocarcinoma or the Klatskin tumor. So the more we go down, the more difficult the surgery becomes. So type 1 is the tumor involves the common hepatic duct. Type 2, it involves the bifurcation. Type 3A, it involves the right hepatic duct. Type 4B, type 3B, it involves the left hepatic duct, and type 4, that involves both the right and left hepatic ducts. So coming on to the management of intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas, they usually arise within normal background of liver parenchyma, and the radiological appearance is also a mass which is arterially enhancing tumor. So radical surgical removal with clear margin is the potentially curative therapy for these cancers. But now transarterial radioembolization and SBRT have been explored for the unresectable disease, which is mostly the case in our scenario, as the patient presentation of resectability stage is very uncommon, and SBRT and these treatments like TACE and TARE have also given a very promising results with a local 5-year local control of almost 80%. So the keeping in mind, we also need to analyze the prognostic factor, the lymph node involvement, and hence if surgery is undertaken, then we really need to see whether the lymphadenectomy has been done at the level of hepatoduodenal ligament. The routine lymph node, regional lymph node dissection is mandatory for R0 resection. Other factors include size and number of tumor, the grade, the presence of any satellite nodules, vascular or perineural invasion. So adjuvant therapy is usually necessary or mandated in case of a node positive or in case of a microscopic positive margin surgery, although the robust evidence for its use is lacking because of less number of cases that we encounter in our day-to-day practice. Coming on to the Klatskin tumor, again, surgery is the treatment of choice if feasible, which includes a lobar hepatic and bile duct resection with a regional lymph node dissection of a minimum of 7 nodes and hepaticojejunostomy. patients presenting with jaundice, initial radiological imaging needs to be carried out before ERCP. That is, we need to see through MRCP which part of the biliary tree gets involved, and whether a ERCP can be undertaken or we have to go for a percutaneous stenting. So biliary drainage before resection, if feasible with immediate surgery, here remains a controversial topic. But in case of locally unresectable cases, which has been explored in a multidisciplinary approach, we see the neoadjuvant chemoradiation followed by brachytherapy has been a very promising treatment of in today's era, which is followed by liver transplantation, and this has been studied extensively in the Mayo Clinic. And promising results have also been shown in charged particle therapy, where we can achieve a biological effective dose of more than 70 gray. Coming on to distal cholangiocarcinoma, in contrast to other forms of cholangiocarcinomas, it requires the removal of the pancreatic head, usually a partial duodenopancreatectomy with extended bile duct resection up to the hilum. Again, to achieve a macroscopic cure, the draining lymph node dissection needs to be done, and appropriate reconstruction is also necessary. And it is seen that the prognosis of the distal cholangiocarcinomas are better than that of the adenoma of head of pancreas. So this is the liver anatomy, the Conrad's classification of liver, which is divided into the segments, where we can see the gallbladder exists here. It is around the segment 5 and 4B. So this, what we discussed earlier, is that suppose we are thinking of hepatic resection. So what we need to do is we need to do a portal venous embolization. And suppose, for example, segment 7, if we want them to do a hepatic resection, so accordingly we will have to embolize this segment and see what is the condition or the hypertrophy level achieved for the other normal future FLR, the future liver remnant, and then we take a decision whether the surgery or resection is going to be successful or not. So this is a small brief summary of the ESMO guideline. Again, early stage surgery is a treatment of choice, and patient mostly end up needing adjuvant chemoradiation. And for locally advanced or metastatic disease, we need to go for systemic chemotherapy. And for performance status of 0 to 1, we need combination chemotherapy. And otherwise, in case of most poor performance status patient, which is usually the case, we go for a single agent gemcitabine monotherapy. So discussed already the importance of the FLR and the portal venous embolization. So this is just a not very good screenshot of extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma management. So anything more than T1N0, we need adjuvant therapy. That is, if the disease or the cancer is located within the bile duct wall, there is nothing much to do. We have already cleared off with appropriate margin, and observation is done after resection. If not, if the cancer has invaded the bile duct wall and gone into the adipose tissue, and it is a node positive disease, or there is microscopic margin positive, then we have to give them adjuvant treatment in form of chemoradiation. And if it is locally unresectable, we can try for chemoradiation, and then as per response, we can again go for transplant. If it's extensive, either chemotherapy or best supportive care is what we need to offer. This is just a summary of what we have discussed till now. And yes, there is no better role of a PET-CT scan. We can easily undertake a CCT thorax abdomen. And if the patient is not complaining and if the patient is complaining of bone pain, then we can undertake a whole body bone scan. But as per the recommendation, CCT thorax abdomen and the detailed anatomy of the disease, we need to go for an MRCP and stenting if needed. So this is as for the staging treatment we have discussed. Coming on to the gallbladder cancer, the more often malignancy that we encounter in our day-to-day practice. Here what we need to see is the AJCC 8th edition changes, which is 2A and 2B classification. So 2A is the tumor which invades the perimuscular connective tissue on the peritoneal side without the involvement of the serosa, while 2B invades the perimuscular tissue on the hepatic side with no extension to the liver. So as we've already discussed in the anatomy, so this is the thing which has been newly introduced in the AJCC 8. Other than that, I have been focusing on the importance of regional lymphadenectomy. So here earlier it was N1 was the involvement of the regional or the first echelon group of lymph nodes, and N2 was the next level of lymph nodes. But now it is said that in the AJCC 8, there is metastasis up to 1 to 3 regional lymph nodes. And if the number of lymph nodes involvement is more than or equal to 4, then it is an N2 disease. Again, coming on to the curative treatment of gallbladder is surgery. So what we find is gallbladder cancer is almost an incidental finding of a cholecystectomy done for gallstones. So what we need to see in the histopathological sample, histopathological report is that whether it has invaded the lamina propria or not. Anything equal to T1A, simple cholecystectomy will do. We don't have to resect or go for a reoperation. But if it takes anything more than T1A, if it is T1B or deeper, then we need an extended resection, which includes hepatic resection. The reason why I showed the anatomy, the segments, we need to resect the segment 4B and 5. That includes an extended liver resection of achieving a clear margin of 2 centimeter, and we may or may not need a bile duct resection as well. So the adjuvant therapy, Mayo Clinic series, Korean retrospective series, and the SEER data analysis have suggested a survival benefit of chemoradiation, that is 5FU based, in node positive cases as well as in microscopic margin positive cases. The treatment field includes the gallbladder fossa and the draining lymph nodes. For subclinical disease, we can go up to 54 gray, and for R1 resection, 60 to 65 gray. Palliative treatment, again, as per the performance status, it is mostly a good performance status. We go for a doublet, while if it is poor, then we go for a single agent gemcitabine or single agent capecitabine. We need to palliate the patient and give them the best supportive care. And obstruction, for treatment of obstruction, we need to do a bilioenteric or a percutaneous or endoscopic stenting. I think that was my last slide. Thank you so much.
Okay, Upashana, that's a really brief and excellent presentation. So I have not find any question in the chat box till now.
Okay, thank you.
So if you can stay with us, and if anyone have any question after the session, we can discuss. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And now our last presentation of today's session by Dr. Suranjan Moitra. It's management of the colon cancer. Suranjan, are you there?
Yes, Kosa, I'm there. Thank you for the nice introduction, and good evening all. Let's share my slide. So is my screen visible?
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm audible too, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you and good evening all. Respected teachers, my seniors, colleagues, friends and juniors. First of all, I would like to congratulate ARYWB team for arranging such a beautiful course concept, and again thanks to the team for giving me such a nice opportunity to deliver the talk. And today's subject is on the colon cancer, and no doubt it's a huge chapter to deal with within just 40 minutes. So these are the contents which are going to be discussed today: the biology of the cancer, hereditary colorectal cancer syndromes, the clinical presentation and staging, surgical principle, adjuvant systemic therapy, treatment of the metastatic disease, and lastly, the concept of targeted therapy of the colon cancer. So, first of all, why we would like to know for the colon cancer? What is the rationale per se? So let's go to a brief part of the epidemiology and overall in the world. The carcinoma is about around fourth largest cancer, and if it is not age adjusted or only on the crude rate, it will come along the third highest incidence in the whole world. And if we go along the sex ratios, the males have the predominantly the third highest incidence in the colorectal cancer, while the female has on the second. And there are about 1 million cases per year in cases of male and around 900,000 cases for the females. And in cases of Europe and America, both in these first and second worlds of our universe, these colorectal cancers comes in the first five leading cause or newly diagnosed cancers there. Whereas in India, uh, among this subcontinent, the colorectal cancer still now around the fifth or sixth position after breast, cervix, and the head neck cancers. But still, I guess this may come out in a greater number if the record keeping is done properly. So coming to the next part, there is a biology of the colon cancer. That is a huge topic actually. And this man, he is Bart Vogelstein, and this man has actually revolutionized the study of cancer. What is the genetics? What is the biology behind this production of cancer, the systemicity or the pathology? Basically, he has suggested that cancer is caused by sequential mutations of the specific oncogenes and the tumor suppressor genes. And he has given a chart diagram that is called the Vogelstein chart or Volgram. And he suggested that in 1988, he first pioneered a genetic model of colorectal carcinoma, and this is called the adenocarcinoma syndrome, which has been again modified later in the 1999 by the Pearson and Vogelstein, and modification suggested that there is a multi-step analysis, multi-step model for the production of these cancer syndromes. Thus, the cancer is usually from the stepwise accumulation of multiple somatic mutations, and which have been given in the brief notification. There's the normal mucosa. After the first hit, there may be some production of early adenoma, which again got hit, and this is ultimately goes to the intermediate adenoma, and so on and so on. After a several terms of these kind of different mutations, ultimately goes into the frank carcinoma, which eventually ultimately goes to the metastasis. And so, what are the pathways? These are different pathways. One is the chromosomal instability pathway, one is mismatch repair pathway, and another is CIMP pathway, which is actually called the CPG island methylated phenotype. So among these, CIN pathway is the highest propensity, is around 85 to 90% of the total colorectal cancers in our universe. And eventually, and unfortunately, these type of cancers have the poorer prognosis than the others. Whereas the mismatch repair genes, which are the called as the satellite instability, that is microsatellite instability diseases, these are account for around 15% of the total colon cancers, and almost all cases of the HNPCC, that is a hereditary non-polypocytic colon cancer, have microsatellite instability diseases. And there is a defect in the mismatch repair gene, ultimately leads to repetitive short segment nucleotide repeats, which may be dozens to hundreds or thousands. And ultimately, this leads to the formation of these type of cancers, whereas these have a better prognosis than the CIN types. And CPG involve actually a cytosine methylation of the nucleotide regimens, nucleotide areas. Those are close proximity to the promoter regions. But this is actually present with commonly with the CIN types, And there are certain types of the consensus type of molecular types of these colonic cancers, which are subtypes along the type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. Among these, type 2 and type 3 is still a gray zone, and its evidence or its robust data is still unavailable to define their clinical significance. Whereas CMS1, which are actually the microsatellite instability diseases, they have the better outcome. Whereas for the CMS type 4, these are actually a poorer prognosis of the diseases and more chemo-resistant diseases. So as I have said, the CMS1 have the worst survival after relapse, and CMS have the, I mean, it has a better survival than the CMS4. So if we go to the classification, the colonic cancer can be classified along the hereditary or non-hereditary types. The hereditary type again can be divided into adenomatous types and hematomatous types. The adenomatous types can be of familial adenomatous polyposis, whereas another type is hereditary non-polypotic colonic cancers. And hematomatous types, these are polyposis syndrome actually per se. These are not per se taken as a colonic cancers, and these have the Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, juvenile polyposis syndrome, Cowden syndrome, etc. And non-hereditary syndromes may have familial predisposition or sporadic. What is the difference between sporadic and familial dispositions? These are actually called, the only difference is the mutations, those are happen in these sporadic or familial cases. In cases of the familial, the first hit is inherited and the second is actually the somatic. Whereas for the sporadic part, the both hits, that is the both of the mutations are somatic. Now, hereditary colorectal cancer syndromes, that is HNPCC, may have the hereditary cancer polypotic syndrome may have several types. One is HNPCC, which is also called as Lynch syndrome, and another is familial adenomatous polyposis. Both of these are autosomal dominant inherited, and the Lynch syndrome has a mutation to the DNA mismatch repair genes, where the most common inherited cause, and familial adenomatous polyposis also have the autosomal dominant, but it has a mutation to the APC gene. And the HNPCC or Lynch syndrome again have two types. One is type 1 and type 2. And the type 1 has proximity towards the proximal colons, where the other, that is a Lynch type 2, is actually associated with other extracolonic cancers like endometrium, ovarian, or gastric, or pancreas, or the prostate, maybe in the renal cancers. It has been documented that in cases of Lynch type 2 diseases, the endometrial carcinoma may represent the most common manifestation in these cases in females which have HMSH type 6 preponderance. And these are the other types, these are the various types of these polyposis diseases or the hereditary cancer colonic syndromes. And I am not going into detail per se for these areas. And for diagnosis of the HNPCC, there are certain criteria which has been coined. The first one is Amsterdam criteria, and each was coined in 1990. But in these cases, the extracolonic manifestation was not being addressed. So again, it has been coined, it has been modified in around 1999 to Amsterdam criteria 2, where the extracolonic manifestation has been included. And for the testing purpose, for the NSG typing or the chromosomal typing, the revised basis of guidelines has been coined in 1987. So coming to the clinical presentation, there may be certain symptoms, and these are actually the symptoms or the signs may actually depends upon the location of the tumor, the gross morphology of the tumor, that is, it may be annular, it may be ulcerative, it may be perforating or proliferating. The most common presentation is actually the change in the bowel habit, that is alternating constipation and spurious diarrhea. There may be association of the loss of appetite or fatigability, easy fatigability, abdominal discomfort, may be associated with anemia. And eventually, there may be some mass which can be palpable per abdominal. Even there are some acute presentation. The patient may come with a history of acute intestinal obstruction or perforation or volvulus in presentation. Commonly, the right-sided colonic carcinoma, usually which are ulceroproliferative growth, may have certain bleeding manifestation per rectum and thus may have complaints of fatigability or may have pallor or anemia and may also present with a palpable mass in the right inguinal region or right inguinal fossa. Whereas in the left colonic cancers, pain, alternating constipation, diarrhea, or absolute constipation, obstipation, or volvulus may be the commonest presentation. Even the bladder presentation, even the bladder symptoms may come down, and if it come down, there may be certain possibilities of having a colovesical fistula. And for the metastatic diseases, when the organ involvement is there, there may be certain areas where the colonic metastasis may happen. Depending on that, there may be presentation of hepatomegaly or ascites or pleural effusion along with cough, shortness of breath on exertion, and eventually may have supraclavicular lymph node metastasis. Now coming to the diagnosis purpose. So how can you diagnose this case? So when a patient come to you with these such complaints or such symptoms, you may guide him or her or your patient with doing a USG whole abdomen or X-ray chest or with the fecal occult blood. But keep in mind these all are such non-specific tests because fecal occult blood test is very non-specific because even the patient if he's taking some iron supplements, the fecal occult blood test may come positive. Even a small growth in anywhere in the abdomen, USG or whole abdomen cannot detect. So better to go with a colonoscopy, which can eventually visualize the disease, the area of the involvement, and keep in mind the colonoscopy may have several types. The most commonly used is the total colonoscopy. That is you have to go up to the ileocecal junction, and or there may be some options. It depends on the decision of the surgeon or per se the endoscopist who can do a flexible sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy depending upon the preparation, etc. And other than that, previously before coming of this colonoscopy, a double contrast enema was being used, where a contrast was given. There is a barium enema was given per rectum. Along with that, after some time, the air also been ingested through the rectum. With these two contrasts, there may be some delineation of filling defect in the colonic wall, but this has a very lesser specificity, and this is eventually obsolete now. So what are the other modalities which we can do for the diagnosis? So we can go with a CT scan whole abdomen with the contrast. Definitely the contrast of the CT scan will delineate easily the lymph nodal metastasis of the colonic carcinoma. Along with that, you can do MRI in specific cases where if patient cannot do we cannot do the contrast enhancement because of the kidney functions. Even MRI may be a troublesome in certain cases where because the MRI takes time for the total sequencing done, and for that CT scan eventually is preferred over MRI for the colonic cancers. Even afterwards, we can do a 3D reconstruction from the CT scan to have a CT colonography, which eventually have a good outcome and good specificity or sensitivity for the colonic cancer. And the tumor marker is very important. That is a CEA, that is a carcinogenic antigen, and it has been found that a preoperative carcinogenic antigen, if it is more than 7.5 nanogram per ml, there may be some have a poor prognostic marker. We can take it as a poor prognostic marker. And after the diagnosis is complete, and with this colonoscopy, with the colonoscopic study, we have to do or we have to take the biopsy from the actual mass for the confirmation. And after that, we also have to do for the metastatic workup. For that, we can go with the CT scan whole abdomen and thorax, and also we can, if there is any suggestion, we can of the brain metastasis, we can go with the MRI of brain with contrast. And after that, lastly, we can have a positron emission tomography CT scan. But keep in mind, PET CT scan should not be done for the diagnosis. It is solely to determine if there is any distal metastasis or not. So coming to the staging, and this staging actually depends upon the tumor. After there is more actually the surgical staging rather than clinical staging, will depend for the treatment purpose. And there are some evolution starting from the previous. It was a Duke's classification that has been coined in around 70s. Afterwards it has been a modification by Astor and Kohler, but Astor Kohler modification is not used nowadays. It's better for historic importance, and the Duke's classification has been modified to have the newer AJCC TNM staging, which are we actually having now for the treatment purpose. And for this TNM staging, there are certain criteria, and keep in mind for the colonic cancer and eventually for the all the visceral cancers, the tumor criteria does not depend upon the size. The tumor criteria actually depends upon the depth of the lesion, how much it has been penetrated through and through the mucosa or the submucosa or the adventitia. Along with that, the nodal criteria is also there. The nodal criteria is being taken as the CAP, that is the College of American Pathologists has recommended that at least 12 to 15 lymph nodes should be detected or dissected out, or should be examined to get a clearer idea or clearer picture to have a better TNM in staging. And for the N1, the N1 disease again being divided into three parts, that is N1A, N1B, and N1C. Eventually, the N1 disease is 1 to 3 lymph nodes positive, whereas N1A is only 1, and N1B is 2 or 3, whereas N1C is stated that there is no such regional lymph node is positive, but there are certain tumor deposit in either subserosa or mesentery, or in the non-peritonealized periodic or pericolic or perirectal or mesorectal tissues. And so in the N1C, there is no such number criteria. Per se, there are some tumor deposits over certain areas which is detected as N1C. And from the AJCC staging 7th edition, there is in the 8th edition, there is a modification in the metastatic staging. Previously, the metastatic disease was divided into M1B and M1A and M1B, but a new term has been coined for this type in 8th staging, that is M1C. That is, M1A is the metastasis to the one site or organ or identified and there is no such peritoneal metastasis. Similarly, M1B is two or more sites or organs is identified without any peritoneal metastasis, and M1C is taken as peritoneal surface metastasis with or without any other organ involvement. So here the M1C suggests that the metastasis to the peritoneal surface is per se a poorest prognosis among the all metastatic diseases. So this is the AJCC prognostic staging. This is per se seeing it is a very difficult to remember, but as a simple view, you can take that for the nodal disease, if it is a nodal disease that is if the node comes positive, it straight away go to the stage 3 disease. Whereas for T1 and T2, it is a stage 1 disease. And for T3, T4, it is stage 2 disease. The T3 is again divided into stage 2A, whereas 4A and 4B is depicted into 2B and 2C disease. After that, when the nodal staging, when the node comes positive, the node is again defined as a 3 disease, and this has been again divided into stage 3A, B, and C. And I am now not going into detail, and keep in mind any metastatic disease, the M1 disease come for the stage 4 disease. The M1A will be for stage 4A, M1B will be stage 4B, and M1C is for the stage 4C. So the stage 4C have the poorest prognosis among all. So what is the surgical principle? The surgical principle, actually the surgery is the mainstay of the curative treatment. So to get a curing for the patient, there should be upfront complete surgery for this purpose, and the surgery should be taken care of to get R0 resection. That is, there should be no there should be no microscopic or macroscopic disease remaining in the tumor bed. The wide resection means the colonic segment which has been involved, that should be totally resected out, along with having a clear-cut 5 centimeter margin at least. Along with that, lymph node dissection should be done along with the mesocolon, and that should be taken out en bloc with adequate bowel continuation. That is, after the resection of these areas, the anastomosis should be done through and through. If it is not possible on the same setting, that should be done in the different setting, keeping a diverting colostomy first, and afterward that should be rejoined again later. So according to the surgical principle, the minimum, as I have said previously, the minimal lymph node dissection should be at least 12, and at least 5 centimeter tumor free margin should be there. And last but not the least is that you should inspect the whole peritoneum before closing down, because there may be some peritoneal deposit or peritoneal seedings, and if it has been there, so there should be staging will be miscalculated if you miss that. Now coming to the adjuvant systemic therapy, the systemic therapy indicates for the some different areas for different there are some different criteria to get adjuvant systemic therapy, and it is not needed for the all cases. So what are the indication for the chemotherapy? If there is a positive node, the T4 lesion, that is nodal positivity, is the indication for adjuvant therapy. T4 disease, venous or microscopic spread, signet ring type, poorly differentiated disease, changes in the CEA level, and as I have said, the CEA level prognostically is a very poor marker if it is a more than 7.7 7.5 nanogram per ml if it is done pre-operatively, and the lymph node dissection if it is inadequate. And there may be some provision of preoperative NSCT, that is induction chemotherapy. If it is previously it is inoperable, then we can do an induction chemotherapy to get stage down the disease and get it operable. So going to the stage wise diseases, for the stage 1 disease, no adjuvant therapy is needed, that is per se no systemic therapy is needed. For stage 2 disease, the role of adjuvant chemotherapy is unclear for stage 2 because there are certain uncertainty or certain gray zones where the chemotherapy should be given. There is no such clear-cut demarcation. And for the stage 2 diseases, there must be some risk estimation who needs the chemotherapy for stage 2 diseases. It is indicated for PT4 or higher grade of the diseases where the LVI, PNI must be positive, less number of lymph nodes has been examined, and indeterminate or close or positive margin, and that is R2 resection, R1 or R2 resection, and if there is history of any perforation or obstruction previously or preoperatively. Because in these cases, obstruction or perforation, in these cases it has been as emergency or acute cases, and eventually in these cases the total resection or a clear-cut resection may not be available because the clonic preparation will be poor. So in cases of high-risk diseases, high-risk stage 2 diseases, the FOLFOX or CAPOX can be given. Along with that, we can have options of FLOX or capecitabine regime, or 5-FU leucovorin may be given in cases where the FOLFOX or CAPOX or FLOX regimen cannot be available or cannot be given due to some other reason, that may be medical reason or something like that. And for low-risk diseases, observation of clinical trial or single-agent capecitabine or 5-FU leucovorin may be enough. And in cases of stage 3 disease, here comes the role of oxaliplatin. Using of platinum is a definite indication for stage 3 disease. So here we can use either a FOLFOX or CAPOX regimen for the treatment of these cases. And other regimen may we give some FLOX regimen or capecitabine and 5-FU plus leucovorin. These last two options are usually reserved because these are not adequate for in cases of stage 3 disease. So these are the different regimens which we can use in different settings of colonic cancers. And here comes the usual history of our evolution of the chemotherapy. The first of all, the 5-FU levamisole was first given, the first in the 70s, and it was a treatment up to still 90s. Afterward, the 5-FU leucovorin has been was used along with that MOF. MOF means there was a only single study there which has arm of having carmastine, oxaliplatin, and 5-fluorouracil. Carmastine, vincristine, and 5-fluorouracil. And I don't know if it is being used nowadays. I have no idea if anyone have been used, but I didn't see anyone to have this type of regimen. And afterwards, the pooled analysis of 5-FU leucovorin was done, and it has been found that it has been a better choice for over the 5-FU and levamisole. Afterwards, in 2005, there are certain evolution of 5-FU leucovorin regimen, the Mayo Clinic regimen, Roswell regimen, and otherwise overall survival was similar. It was found. In 2006, there was introduction of Tegafar. After that, introduction of oxaliplatin was done in 2007. Afterward, in 2009, the oxaliplatin infusion over the 5-FU leucovorin was found to be better in cases of stages 3 disease. And the nowadays, it was been found the involvement of in after the 2012, it was the area where the targeted therapy, the like cetuximab or bevacizumab, was coming into the front. So this is again the area where the stage 3 and stage 3 high risk stage 2 disease where the Folfox or oxaliplatin is preferred over the 5-FU and leucovorin, as I have said. And among the 5-FU and leucovorin regimen, there are certain regimens which having these two agents, and the schedule of these two regimens actually doesn't affect any efficacy, but toxicity may be different. The Mayo Clinic regimen is usually monthly, and it is more commonly associated with leukopenia. And leukopenia eventually comes with febrile neutropenia, with stomatitis, with diarrhea, and certain mucositis, etc. Whereas in Roswell Park weekly regimen, it is more associated with diarrhea. The infusional 5-FU and leucovorin may have less toxicity versus the bolus. And it was been documented that nicuronidecon has no benefit in the adjuvant setting over oxaliplatin, and no targeted agent usually used in the adjuvant setting. So coming to the radiation therapy part in colon cancer, and it's still a very gray and debatable area because there is no such robust data showing any benefit for the adjuvant radiation therapy in colon cancer. It was been coined before to aim the tumor-bed irradiation to decrease the local failure, and it was been coined that it should be delivered in a highly conformal manner. And there are certain indication that was being used, but it's not still a standard of care for any kind of colon cancers per se. Now coming to the treatment for the metastatic disease, the metastatic disease actually can be divided into several parts because previously the metastatic disease was found to be was thought to be a very debilitating condition, and eventually the first and the foremost, the only therapy was probably the best supportive care. But nowadays it has been found that metastatic disease can be taken up in different way, that maybe with the help of the number of or the organ involvement or the number of the total metastases has been there, and depending on that it can be divided into a frank metastatic disease or oligometastatic disease. And for resectable disease there are certain criterias for the resection of the, even for the metastatectomy can be done. And here the resectable disease we can do with a colectomy upfront with a synchronous resection of the liver or lung metastasis followed by a adjuvant chemotherapy, that may be Folfox or Capox. And eventually, if firstly it is seen that it is inoperable, we can try with the neoadjuvant or induction setting with the help of the certain area Folfox or Capox regimen. And if the patient can be downstage, that can be taken for a curative resections. And if it is unresectable per se, then chemotherapy is a sole treatment of choice and treated with chemotherapy, and it will be evaluated every 2 months to assess the resectability. If the liver or the lung metastasis can be resected out, that can be done. And along with that, a colon resection if the risk of obstruction or there is any significant bleeding, depending upon the acuteness of the presentation. And for the patients which are able who are able to undergo resection for the metastatic disease, the 6-month adjuvant therapy can be done with an active regimen. That may be a FOLFOX, that may be a COPOX. For the advanced disease, observation or shortened course of palliative chemotherapy can be opted for also. And the patients, as I have said previously, that the patients with the unresectable metastatic colorectal cancers treated with the BSC, that is the best supportive care previously, have poor prognosis. That a median overall survival was 5 months when these multi-agentic chemotherapy was not being introduced. In contrast, the patients who have receiving the chemotherapy, now it has been shown that the median overall survival may be taken up to 2 years or more. So this is a consortium diagram when we can where we can use the different settings of chemotherapy. Say for example, if we give a first line therapy with a FOLFOX chemotherapy, then that is oxaliplatin based. Then afterwards we can shift to the irinotecan based chemotherapy and something like that. If irinotecan given first line, that usually not done. But if it is given, then we can shift to the FOLFOX therapy, and similarly after that again the second progression come, then we can start with the targeted therapies. So targeted therapy. The targeted therapy is actually the agents which are being targeted to certain receptors who are being taken as the sole responsible for the mutation of these starting of this cancer. That is a mutation drive for these cancers. And eventually, for this targeted therapy, all the patients with the metastatic cancers, that is metastatic colorectal cancer, should have tumor tissue genotyped for the RAS mutations and other targeted mutations for the benefit of these agents. And there are certain molecules. The primary molecule was used was a cetuximab, and these cetuximab or monoclonal antibodies was against the epidermal growth factor receptor, that is a EGFR. This is indicated for KRAS wild type and EGFR expressing colonic tumor, and can be added after the FOLFOX or FOLFIRI as the first line treatment of metastatic colonic cancer. So, and similarly for the panitumumab is also against wild type of KRAS, that is wild type of the EGFR, and US FDA also approved for the panitumumab for use of the patients in metastatic colorectal cancer refractory to FOLFIRI. So for these two parts, that is a cetuximab and panitumumab, that is both of these are against the EGFR. Keep in mind that EGFR expression factor here is different from those in the lung cancer. These for the JR1 and JR2. That keep in mind these two are different from those for the EGFR studies in the lung. In lung, we actually study the driver mutations. There is a mutation analysis done for the lung cancers. Whereas here we see if the EGFR is a wild type, that is a normal type or mutation type. If it is a mutated, then cetuximab or panitumumab will never come to into act. So for cetuximab or panitumumab to use, you must have the EGFR non-mutated or wild type. And there is bevacizumab also. This is a monoclonal antibody that is actually used against the VEGF, that is the vascular endothelial growth factor, and it also can be used either for the FOLFIRI or with the FOLFOX or the XELOX, that is the CAPOX, as a first line or second line treatment. And usually it has been found to be effective to be used with the FOLFIRI or FOLFOX, not as a single agent. The aflibercept, it is also an anti-VEGF molecule and evaluated as a component of a second line therapy. And in the patients with a metastatic colorectal cancer, the use of FOLFIRI plus aflibercept is an acceptable second line therapy in the patients previously treated with FOLFOX regimen. So basically, after the FOLFOX, usually it is commonly done that first line therapy is given as a FOLFOX along with the bevacizumab or aflibercept or something like that, and then actually the second line comes with the FOLFIRI, the irinotecan based. And lastly, the regorafenib. Regorafenib is an inhibitor of the multiple tyrosine kinase inhibitor, including VEGF, is including the PDGF, FGFR, BRAF, RET, and KIT. It is also indicated in metastatic setting, which has also progressed to the previous lines, like, say for example, the 5-FU, oxaliplatin, irinotecan, and bevacizumab, aflibercept, cetuximab, panitumumab based chemotherapy. And it has been cleared by the FDA for the regorafenib in patients who had progressed for the prior therapy with these regimens. And that is, guess, the last slide of mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Suranjan, for the excellent presentation. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Hello.
You're-
Yeah. Okay. So this is an excellent presentation and very brief presentation. There are some questions in the chat box. The first question by Dr. Ravi. Dr. Upasana, are you there? Dr. Upasana, are you there?
Yes, hello. Yeah, I'm there.
Oh, okay, fine. So there is one question for you, I guess, by Dr. Avi. Is there any role of neoadjuvant CTRT of CT in borderline resectable CAGB?
As of now, for standard of care, I don't think there is a role of NACT currently, but things need to be explored. But as of now, I don't think there is a standard of care of role of NACT in borderline operable cancer. But yes, neoadjuvant chemotherapy can be tried and followed by CAGB. But this is, I think, open to all if anybody has some suggestions or some other answers to give. But I don't think as of now there is such standard of care.
Okay, thank you. Basically, what happens, can I add something, Upasana?
Yeah, sure. Please.
Yeah, sure. Basically, for Dr. Avi, if it is a unresectable and ultimately, if you are going for a chemotherapy in these patients, after chemotherapy of 2 to 3 cycles, you might assess for the resectability. There is no such guidelines till now, but after this chemotherapy, if the mass reduced in size, then you might send the patient to the surgeon for the resectability. So I find such in among 50 patients, might 3 or 4 patients might go for the resectability after neoadjuvant chemotherapy. But if anyone have any experience, Dr. Abhishek or anyone, you can share.
No, this is Dr. Abhishek. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So again, I'm sorry I could not attend the first presentation, but I saw both the presentations by Upasana and Suranjan, and I must congratulate both of them for excellent presentations, especially Upasana, because I know that she stepped in quite late, and it was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you
So
so much, sir.
I would just like to add a couple of things. First, the point that Kaustubh made. Yes, this is not a standard of care, but in a case which is borderline resectable, and there is a scope for CTRT, of course, but the issue, I think, more would be for upfront unresectable. For borderline resectable, the approach, as Kaustubh rightly mentioned, is neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by reassessment, many of which would actually be converted into a resectable tumor. But for unresectable, the scope of CTRT, both for pancreas as well as for GB, would be slightly more. However, I would just like to add one very important anecdote, and I think this is relevant, is the incidence of CA gallbladder. So this has been almost an avalanche, if I may use that word. When we were residents about a decade or so back, we on an average used to get about one new case of CA gallbladder once in a month. If I am not mistaken, most of you who are at least practicing in different parts of West Bengal would now be getting roughly around 2 to 3 cases per OPD. So that is roughly an 8 to 10 times increase. And this is really something that is not, recognized enough or talked about enough. And I'm saying this because biology does matter, and there is a lot of preclinical work that is going on even in India. Along the Gangetic belt, there seems to have been an explosion of CA gallbladder, and unfortunately, most of these are not resectable or borderline resectable, they are metastatic. So this is a problem that we face. The prognosis of CA gallbladder, as Upasana already talked about, is dismal to say the least, and this is a genuine problem. So that is what I have to add. And I think Shuranjan, there is a question for a couple of questions for Shuranjan as well.
Yeah, I'm going to ask. Okay. Abhishek.
I have already
Thank you very
answered on type.
Okay, fine. So you have answered the both of the questions.
Yeah, right.
There is some screening guideline you have already answered, I guess. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
But Shuranjan, can I
Oh.
just comment? I think the MSI part, which I think one question was on MSI, right?
Yeah.
Have you answered that?
Definite criteria address.
Yeah, I have,
So
I have,
Shuranjan had been mentioned some criteria exactly. Yeah.
No, I understand, but I think the question was more to do with how MSI is relevant for the management of
Exactly.
metastatic. I mean, sorry, for colon cancer. So that I think, Shuranjan, it's better that you make a comment regarding that.
basically, I have no personal experience on that. Vijay, if you can, you can take the
Okay,
question.
I can just come in. I think that's a relevant question. Actually, I think it comes from Debanjan, if I'm not mistaken. So the point is, the microsatellite instability is something which is relevant in colon cancer, and this is particularly relevant in what you mentioned so nicely in your presentation about stage 2. So if you have a T3N0, especially, or sometimes a T4N0, you have to actually, as per recommendations, look for MSI. Now, if MSI is high, that is microsatellite instability is high, the general consensus is that the patient would not be a suitable candidate for chemotherapy, especially 5-FU-based chemotherapy. However,
Yes.
if the MSI is low or if it is MSS, which is microsatellite stable, then there is a definite case for chemotherapy. Again, there is, without complicating matters much, if it is MSI high, there is also a case of looking at the BRAF mutation, particularly the BRAF V600E. So if BRAF is mutated in MSI high, then it becomes again high risk. In general, just to make things clear, MSI high, the benefit of chemotherapy, especially 5-FU-based chemotherapy, is minimal, but prognostically it is better. And MSS or MSI low, the benefit of chemotherapy is more, but prognostically it is poorer. So that is in more or less a nutshell about this. It is not so much relevant in metastatic, although there is very recent evidence that MSI high tumors may be benefiting with immunotherapy, but this evidence I think is not still level 1, so we should not discuss it in this forum. And just one small addition to this is regarding the testing for BPD, which I think is important because it is also recommended, and I have some personal experience of doing this, so I'll just share it very briefly. So DPD, or dihydropyrimidine dehydrogenase, is an enzyme by which 5-FU is catabolized, and if there is any mutation in this enzyme, 5-FU accumulates in the body and causes serious toxicity like diarrhea or neutropenia, which can even be fatal. So it is now recommended, especially in elderly patients above 60 years, you should go ahead and do a DPD mutational analysis. Bear in mind, this is not theoretical because it is available with number of laboratories in this part of the world, and the cost is roughly between 5,000 and 7,000 rupees. So it is not something which is completely impractical. Ideally, you should do this, and if it is heterozygous mutant, you should not give 5-FU. And if it is, I'm sorry, homozygous mutant, you should not give 5-FU. And if it is heterozygous mutant, you should give 5-FU or capecitabine in reduced doses. So that is another thing that I think is important. Thank you once again.
Okay, thank you, Avishekda, for your excellent input regarding CA-GB and CA colon some point. And I think there is no other questions there. So with that note, I'd like to thank all the speakers, and we will again meet on the next Friday for our 7th module of our clinical oncology course. And thank you, and thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.